The Everest, known as the roof of the world, rises at the center of an eternal struggle between the human desire to push boundaries and the magnificent beauty of nature. Conquering it is a test of both courage and unyielding determination. Those who dare to climb this colossal mountain summit are either honored or face very heavy consequences. It is both the dream and the nightmare of climbers. Scaling its high peak allows you to understand how great and how small humanity is simultaneously. Tonight's work invites you on an unforgettable and daunting journey towards the peaks to explore the human struggle against nature and the sacred desire to reach the summit of Everest. Everest is not just a mountain. It is a mythology, a story, and a source of endless adventure. Known as Chomolungma among the local people in Tibet and Nepal, Everest translates to Goddess Mother or Mother of the World. In this mythology, Everest is considered a source of life and is seen as a protective spirit. Many legends and stories surround the mountain, including encounters with mysterious creatures known as Yeti, roaming around its slopes. Yeti is regarded as a sacred being among the local population and is seen as a mysterious part of the Himalayan region. According to Tibetan Buddhism, the Himalayas are part of the Shambhala kingdom. According to this myth, Shambhala is a place where individuals seek inner awakening, and Everest and its surroundings are believed to be part of this mystical kingdom. These regions are considered sacred according to many belief systems, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, and religious rituals and visits are conducted in these places. Everest and Lhotse are considered inseparable companions among the local people. Lhotse is situated on the opposite side of Everest, and it is believed that these two mountains symbolize a mythical marriage. These mythologies and legends demonstrate how Everest and the Himalayas are integrated into the local cultures and beliefs. The mountains hold great significance for the spiritual and cultural heritage of these regions, and these myths profoundly influence the lives of the communities surrounding the mountains. By the early 20th century, British explorers had attempted to reach the North and South Poles, but their efforts had been unsuccessful. However, the desire to regain national prestige drew them to the challenge of Mount Everest, the world's highest peak. Approaching this mountain was problematic during that time. The current standard south climbing route was closed by Nepalese authorities, who were unwilling to grant permission to Western travelers to climb their sacred mountains. The north route, supported by Tibetan authorities, also imposed obstacles for foreigners. Tibet was part of the Great Game, a struggle for dominance in Central Asia between the Russian and British empires at that time. Eventually, the British Indian government had to exert influence on the 13th Dalai Lama to organize explorations. The main disadvantage of the north climbing route was its extremely short duration between winter and the onset of the monsoon season, making any expedition challenging. Additionally, a long journey was required to reach its base, traveling through high and snowy passes around Kanchenjunga in the Sikkim region of North India to Tibet via Tingri. However, they only needed to complete the initial stage using the Arun route, reaching the Rongbuk Glacier on the north face of Chomolungma. They transported loads using horses, yaks, and hired local carriers. As a result, the team could only reach Everest at the end of April, with only 68 weeks remaining until the late June onset of the monsoon. During this time, they had to acclimate to high altitude, establish camps, and complete the climb. The first humans to conquer Mount Everest were Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, who reached the summit on May 29, 1953. This achievement marked the date when Everest was successfully climbed for the first time and is considered a significant milestone in the history of climbing. The success of Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay marked a turning point in climbing history, greatly increasing interest in Everest ascents. This place is a harsh teacher that brings humanity's triumphs and tragedies to the same summit, blurring the line between victory and defeat, heroism and tragedy. The first attempts to climb Mount Everest took place in the mid-1920s and early 1930s. The first major Everest exploration expedition, the 1921 British expedition, was carried out by George Mallory and other climbers. However, this expedition failed to reach the summit, leading to preparations for the next expedition under George's leadership. The British returned to Everest in 1922 for a second attempt. During this expedition, climbing was achieved up to approximately 8,320 meters. Additionally, a tragic avalanche occurred during this expedition, resulting in the loss of 7 climbers' lives. This disaster negatively impacted the climb, leading to its failure. Although the 1922 expedition did not reach its goal, it helped them better understand the challenges and dangers of the mountain. Furthermore, this expedition laid the foundation for lessons to be learned in subsequent climbs. After the 1922 expedition, due to a lack of adequate time and financial resources, the 1923 expedition could not take place. The Joint Everest Committee had lost £700 due to the bankruptcy of Alliance Bank in Shimla. By 1924, the British team organized their third expedition to Everest. Similar to the 1922 expedition, the 1924 expedition brought bottled oxygen to the mountain. Over the years, oxygen equipment had been improved, but it was still not very reliable. Additionally, there was no real agreement on whether to use this assistance or not, sparking an ongoing debate. Sporting arguments aimed to climb Everest in a fair manner without technical measures to mitigate the effects of thousands of meters of altitude. Choosing the climbers for the expedition, led by General Charles Bruce as in 1922, was not an easy process. The number of strong young men had decreased due to World War I. Names like George Mallory, Howard Somervell, Edward Norton, and Geoffrey Bruce were among the few selected for this task. George Angle Finch, who had reached a record height in 1922, was proposed as a member but was ultimately not included. The committee's reasons for this decision were Finch's divorce and payment for lectures. Committee Secretary Arthur Hinks found it unacceptable for an Australian to be the first on Everest, and the British wanted the climb to be seen as an example of British spirit and a morale-boosting event. Initially, George Mallory refused to climb without Finch, but at Hinks' request, he was personally persuaded by the British royal family. New members of the climbing team included Noel Odell, Bentley Beetham, and John Dewshazard. Participants were not selected solely based on mountaineering skills. Their status, military experiences, or higher education played roles in the selection process. Military experience was crucial during those times for creating public images and communication with the media. The team, led by Charles Bruce and his assistant General Edward Norton, included climbers George Mallory, Bentley Beetham, Geoffrey Bruce, the now academician Hinks, who was also an engineer, and the team doctor, Andrew Irwin, an engineering student. John Noel, another soldier, served as the team's photographer and videographer, and Howard Somervell, who was also a doctor, had the task of transport and translation in the expedition. In 1960, the Chinese made history by being the first to reach the summit via the Northeast Ridge route. Prior to that, British climbers had attempted a different approach since 1922, trying to reach a large couloir by overcoming a massive wall known as the North Face. They then ascended along the border of the couloir towards the pyramid summit. This route had been as unsuccessful as Reinhold Messner's solo climb in 1980. The expedition had planned the locations of predetermined high camps. Camp 1, used as an intermediate camp at the entrance of the East Rongbuk Glacier, was at an altitude of 5,400 meters. Camp 2, another intermediate camp at around 6,000 meters, was utilized. Camp 3, the main high camp at 6,400 meters, was about 1 kilometer away from the icy slopes leading towards the North. Call porters were hired to carry materials between the base camp and the main high camp. These porters were paid approximately 1 shilling per day. By the end of April, camp positions were expanded, and this process was completed in the first week of May. Due to the storm, they had to postpone their progress. When the weather cleared, Samuel and Odell reached Camp 3 on May 19th. The next day, they started fixing ropes on the icy slopes leading to the North Cedar. On May 21st, they established Camp 4 at an altitude of 7,000 meters. Unfortunately, the weather deteriorated again. John Devvara stayed at Camp 4 with 12 carriers and limited food supplies. Eventually, only 8 carriers could return, and Norton Mallory rescued the other 4 sick carriers. Afterward, the team returned entirely to Camp 1. Climbing attempts were organized in a planned order. Mallory and Bruce would make the first attempt, followed by Sum and Norton. Hazard, supporting from Camp 3, would assist in directing Cedar from Camp 4. These support team members would also serve as a backup team for a possible third attempt. The first and second attempts were planned without using bottled oxygen. On June 1, 1924, Mallory and Bruce set out from North Cedar with 9 carriers. Although Camp 4 was relatively sheltered, they faced sharp icy winds as they crossed the ice walls. 4 carriers decided to drop their loads before reaching Camp 5 at an altitude of 7,681 meters while setting up the platform. Bruce and a carrier took the abandoned equipment. The next day, 3 carriers decided not to climb higher. This rendered unnecessary the establishment of Camp 6 at 8,117 meters according to the original plan. During the descent, the first climbing group was met at the settlement where Norton and Somerville started their new ascent. The summit was only 280 meters above, but due to increasing terrain difficulty, time constraints, and doubts about remaining strength, they decided to turn back. On the 14th, they reunited with Somerville and started the descent. While following Norton, Somerville experienced a severe throat obstruction. In a desperate attempt, he pressed his hands against his lungs and managed to clear the obstruction called mucosa. He then continued to follow Norton. Norton suffered intense eye pain and temporary blindness overnight. He remained blind for 60 hours and stayed at Camp 4 on June 5 to coordinate carriers from his tent. On June 6th, they brought Norton to Camp 3 with a group of 6 carriers. On June 5th, Moll and Irwin stayed at Camp 4. Mallory discussed with Norton the decision to choose Irwin as a climbing partner. Despite Irwin's lack of high-altitude climbing experience, Norton, supporting Mallory's plan due to Air's practical skills with oxygen equipment, endorsed it. Mallory and Irwin, who had become friends during their travels in India, and Mallory found Irwin physically strong. On June 6th, Mallory and Irwin, accompanied by 8 carriers, set out for Camp 5 at 8:40. They had a modified oxygen device and daily food with them. Around 5 p.m. on the same day, 4 carriers returned from Camp 5 with a note from him. The note said, "There is no wind here, and everything looks promising." On June 7th, Odell, Norton, and a team of carriers set out for Camp 5 to support the climbing team. On the way, Odell found an abandoned oxygen breathing apparatus, but it was missing a mouthpiece. He took the device to Camp 5, but could not find a spare mouthpiece. Shortly after arriving at Camp 5, Mallory and 4 assisting carriers returned. They conveyed the message from him, stating their plan to start working early the next day. On June 8th, Odell, along with Norton at an observation camp above Camp 3, started watching the climb in the early hours. They used a telescope and were ready to activate the camera if any climbers were seen. However, they did not see anyone, and until 10 a.m., weather conditions obstructed their views. In the early hours of June 8th, Odell reported calm winds and a peaceful night's sleep. At 8 o'clock, he started climbing to Camp 6 to support Mallory and Irvine and conduct geological research. However, foggy weather limited visibility, preventing Mallory and Irvine from reaching the northeast ridge they planned to ascend. When Odell cleared a protrusion at 7,900 meters, the fog suddenly dissipated, and he observed that Mallory and Irvine were approaching the base of the last pyramid. Later in his report, Odell explained that when the weather cleared, he observed the summit ridge and the final pyramid of Everest. He mentioned seeing a small black dot. Like Mallory, a small black dot, Irvine, was walking along a snowy ridge, progressing toward the first rock step. However, Odell couldn't definitively say whether the second dot had reached the summit of the ridge. Initially, Odell thought they had reached the lower step of the mountain, but he became concerned when Mallory and Irvine were delayed by 5 hours from the planned schedule. Following this observation, Odell wanted to return to Camp 6 to search for the climbers on the mountain. However, at 2 p.m., a heavy snowstorm started, and despite trying to signal Mallory and Irvine by going outside, Odell had to give up due to severe cold. Odell waited at Camp 6 until around 4 p.m. the next day since Mallory and Irvine did not return, and no signs were seen. No one was visible. Since there was only one tent at Camp 6 and only 2 people could fit in it, Mallory had advised Odell to leave and return to Camp 4 on the North Col. Odell left Camp 6 at 4:30 p.m. and arrived at Camp 4 at 6:45 p.m. As Mallory and Irvine were not seen on that day or the next, Odell climbed again with 2 carriers. They reached Camp 5 and stayed there overnight. The next day, Odell went to Camp 6 alone and found that nothing had changed. He climbed to approximately 8,200 meters. There was no trace of the 2 climbers. At Camp 6, Odell laid 6 blankets in the shape of a cross on the snow and marked the advanced upper camp. No signs were found. Hopes were in vain. An order was expected. Subsequently, he descended to Camp 4. On the morning of June 11th, the team began descending the icy slopes of the North Ridge, officially completing the reconnaissance trip. In memory of the climbers who lost their lives on Everest in the 1920s, the members of the reconnaissance trip built a memorial pyramid. Mallory and Irvine were declared national heroes. Climbers from Cambridge Magdalen College and Oxford University laid memorial stones to honor them. King George V, officials, climbers' families, and friends attended the ceremony held at St. Paul's Cathedral. The official film of the reconnaissance trip, Everest Epic, directed by John Noel, led to a diplomatic scandal known as the Dancing Llamas Incident. As a result, the Dalai Lama closed access to new expeditions until 1933 due to unauthorized actions during this incident and the reconnaissance trip. Members of the reconnaissance trip were questioned by many who doubted the location where Odell claimed to have seen Mallory and Irvine. Some believed that the challenging second step could not be opened within the short time Odell observed them. However, Odell and Norton believed they reached the summit, and Odell publicly stated this in newspapers. A theory suggesting that the summit was reached based on Mallory's skills and their location, supported by renowned climber Martin Conway, was also proposed. Under pressure, Odell changed his narrative several times. Most climbers thought they were seen in the easier first step. Inconsistencies emerged regarding the weather conditions he described. The exact location of his observations was uncertain, and he admitted this. Odell found significant evidence of Mallory and Irvine's ascent at Camps 5 and 6. This evidence indicated possible issues with oxygen equipment and a delay that could have hindered the climb. Several years later, the Rattle expedition surprised everyone by finding an electric lamp powered by a hand generator at camp. And a lamp functioning at Camp 4 was found in 1933 by Percy Wynne Harris as he descended the icy slopes of the ridge. This indicated a fatal accident or a slide. In 1975, a Chinese climber claimed to have seen a dead British climber at an altitude of 8,100 meters, sparking great interest. George Mallory's body was discovered on Everest in 1999 by American climber and researcher Conrad Anker. This event occurred approximately 75 years after Mallory and Andrew Irvine went missing during their 1924 ascent. The body was frozen and partly covered with ice and snow. The clothing and equipment that Mallory wore were still relatively well preserved. There were signs of falls and some injuries on the body. The absence of oxygen equipment and missing snow goggles weakened the possibility that they had reached the summit. Andrew Irvine's body has not yet been found. Mallory and Irvine's 1924 ascent of Everest continues to be shrouded in uncertainty regarding its outcome and success. Rumors and claims circulated for a period suggesting that Mallory and Irvine reached Everest in 1924. Some argued that their clothing was of low quality and that Odell's reports did not accurately reflect the climb. However, in 2006, Graham Highland's recreation of their clothing proved its functionality and comfort at high altitudes. Some theories propose that what Odell saw might have been birds. According to this theory, Odell's potentially misleading observations could have led to a misunderstanding of the climbers. A similar situation was observed in 1933 by Eric Shipton in a high-altitude observation. The considerable distance from Camp 6 to the summit makes it improbable for a climb starting at dawn to reach the top before darkness falls. However, a similar achievement was accomplished by Ed Viesters in 1990, but he was familiar with the route beforehand. Mallory and Irvine ventured into an unknown area. The 1924 Everest British expedition remains a memorable masterpiece in climbing history. Although the exact fate of George Mallory and Andrew Irvine during their climbs is unknown, their courage and determination still inspire future generations of climbers. The innovative spirit of the expedition laid the foundation for future efforts to conquer the world's highest summit, despite challenges and time constraints. The legacy of the 1924 Everest British expedition continues to live on, and we may never truly know whether Irvine's body or camera will be found. The story of Mallory and Irvine remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of mountaineering.